Russian tactics at the front have begun to change. The invaders are now moving away from large settlements, trying not to enter and fight in them. Sergei Tsehatsky, an officer of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, cited the example of the city of Pokrovsk in his program on Channel 24. The Russians tried to break in at the end of the summer of 2024, but realized that they would suffer huge losses. In 2025, the invaders tried to bypass the city of Pokrovsk and advance towards the Pokrovsk-Pavlograd highway. This leads to huge losses for them, which must be compensated. The officer of the Armed Forces of Ukraine continued, "I want to emphasize that they surrendered with great joy. Their eyes shine when they fall into our captivity. They tell very interesting things. The most important thing is that they report on the state of their troops." According to Tsehatsky, Russian commanders torture even their own men. They are also constantly lying about the real situation and constantly launching meat attacks. They have no choice because the monster Putin is kicking them out. One by one, Russian soldiers are surrendering because they can't stand the pressure any longer. Many occupiers are acting with great self-confidence because they like the Ukrainian attitude towards the surrendering Russian soldiers. The surrender of at least 20 invaders every day has caused a major crisis among Russian generals. The conditions offered by the Ukrainian army to the surrendered occupiers are among the options that attract them. Another group of occupiers was captured today as the occupiers surrendered rapidly. A prisoner allegedly told the 71st Separate Jaeger Brigade that 7 Russians and 1 Ukrainian met in the basement. After running out of ammunition, the Ukrainians captured the Russians, who allegedly offered to surrender to the man. According to the brigade's report, a Ukrainian paratrooper damaged the MTLB of the Russians' armored vehicle with a single-use grenade launcher. The Russian forces, who managed to escape, launched an attack on the structure where Ukrainian forces had set up fortifications. With the help of the assault group, the Ukrainian army cleared the building and captured 6 attackers after nearly 3 hours of fighting, following the call for reinforcements. According to Ukrainian forces, Russian activity in the Volchansk direction decreased in early January 2025 as a result of operations in Russia's Kursk Oblast. According to Kharkiv OTU spokesman Yevgeny Romanov, the Ukrainian Defense Forces managed to thwart the efforts of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance organizations to reach the Vovchansk aggregate plant. Later, Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky said that about 15,000 Russian troops were neutralized by Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk direction of Donetsk Oblast in January. Syrsky said that the region is one of the hottest areas on the front line, adding that Ukrainian forces are constantly inflicting losses on the invaders. In January this year alone, our troops neutralized more than 15,000 invaders here, of which about 7,000 were liquidated. According to a report published by the monitoring group Deep State, the intensity of Russian attacks on the front lines is generally decreasing, but remains high. Russian forces have concentrated 44% of their attacks in the Pokrovsk sector, a critical logistics hub for Ukrainian troops in Donetsk Oblast. Viktor Trehubov, spokesman for Ukraine's Khortytsia force group, said Russian forces had deployed small groups to encircle Ukrainian troops in the sector. Russia's offensive efforts on the front lines were most intense in the second half of December, following a surge in attacks that began in late November. According to data published by the Ukrainian Armed Forces, 840,260 of Moscow's troops have been wounded or liquidated since 2022. Russia's losses in Ukraine are helping to fuel a demographic time bomb that could lead to the country's population being cut in half by the end of the century, experts told the Kyiv Independent newspaper earlier this month. "The impact on Russian society has been devastating," said Harley Balzer, professor emeritus of government and international relations at Georgetown University. Harley Balzer continued, "From Russia's point of view, winning the war in Ukraine is a smaller problem. The bigger issue is whether it will be a viable country after that. On the other hand, Russia has experienced another major crisis." Sergei Yefremov, deputy governor of the Primorsky Krai of the Russian Federation, commander of the Tiger Occupation Detachment, was liquidated in the Kursk region. Sergei Yefremov, the commander of the Tiger Volunteer Unit, was liquidated while returning from a combat mission, said Oleg Kozhemyako, the governor of Primorsky Krai, without giving further details. Yefremov headed the Tiger Volunteer Detachment, which was formed in the summer of 2022, on the basis of the 105th Separate Guard Marine Brigade of the Pacific Fleet. In August 2024, he and the unit's soldiers were reportedly sent to the Kursk region. Analysts specializing in the field said that the vehicle in which Yefremov was traveling hit a mine in the Kursk region and exploded. In addition to him, another officer was liquidated. Yefremov was awarded the title of Hero of the DPR, the Post said. At the end of January, soldiers of the 8th Regiment of the Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine cleared Russian positions in the Kursk region, inflicting significant manpower losses on the enemy and capturing important trophies. While all these conflicts are raging, the initiative to deploy peacekeepers on Ukrainian territory in the event of a ceasefire agreement is being actively discussed in European political circles. However, there is no consensus among EU countries on this issue, and there are significant differences between the positions of the states. The UK, France, and Northern European countries are in favor of sending peacekeepers. They believe that the deployment of a significant number of European troops would help prevent further attacks and stabilize the region. The Times reports that these countries are prepared to consider sending tens of thousands of troops to protect the border between Russia and Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire. Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, however, are skeptical. They fear that sending troops to Ukraine could weaken their own defenses and increase the risk of direct conflict with Russia. They are also concerned about the possibility of diverting needed resources from countries bordering NATO and depriving them of adequate protection. One of the main obstacles to the implementation of this initiative is the lack of U.S. approval. U.S. President Donald Trump has previously ruled out the possibility of U.S. troops participating in such a mission and emphasized that Europe should take on the task on its own. In response, European ministers have asked the United States to provide air support, including air defense systems and intelligence technology, which could make the mission vulnerable. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stressed the necessity of U.S. involvement in such an initiative, noting that other countries would not risk sending troops to Ukraine without Washington's support. Kyiv needs at least 200,000 peacekeepers to ensure security, he said. For Russia, the idea of NATO peacekeepers entering Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable. Such a step could lead to an uncontrolled escalation of the conflict, the Russian Foreign Ministry said. While the work for Ukraine continues apace, Russia is desperate and resorting to horrible means. The British Ministry of Defense has publicly stated that wounded Russian soldiers are likely to return to combat duty in Ukraine, often on crutches and with unhealed wounds. According to open-source data, analysts say that the 20th Combined Arms Army of the Russian Federation is forming foot assault groups of wounded soldiers and sending them into battle. There is a real possibility that the Russian command is doing this to retain personnel who would otherwise be lost in an overloaded medical system, intelligence experts say. The British Ministry of Defense has suggested that wounded Russian soldiers who were discharged early from medical facilities on the orders of their commanders may have been sent back to their units. The report said this would reduce the burden on the overburdened military health system and increase the ability of troops to track wounded soldiers and use them in operational missions. British analysts noted that the lack of medical care in institutions far from the front line necessitated the transfer of administrative and medical burden back to the military units. When we look at this scenario, the surrender of Russian army soldiers to Ukraine seems a very plausible option. The Russian military is known for its various atrocities. Ukrainian citizens illegally recruited by the Russians and living in the temporarily occupied territories have faced beatings, bullying, and terrible conditions of service. According to the I Want to Live project, last fall 30 illegally recruited people from the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions were included in a military unit in occupied Crimea. The Russians appointed Caucasians as sergeants who incited ethnic hatred and systematically organized beatings. They also set off training bombs in the barracks, create unbearable living conditions, and make Ukrainians watch them pray. In addition to being systematically humiliated by Caucasian commanders, the illegally recruited also complain of terrible and inadequate food. By these actions, the Russian Federation is in gross violation of the Geneva Convention for the protection of civilian persons in time of war. According to the convention, occupying powers are prohibited from forcing, coercing, or encouraging local populations to serve in their armed or auxiliary forces. We appeal to all Ukrainian citizens illegally mobilized into the Russian army. You are victims of a war crime. For Ukraine, you are not traitors or criminals. The occupiers intend to use you as cannon fodder in the war against your own country. 3 Russian soldiers who sued the Russian Defense Ministry over forged contracts were liquidated in the operation against Ukraine, according to analysts with expertise in the field. The three Sakhalin residents had been fighting a legal battle with the ministry for nearly 9 months. The forged signatures were only officially confirmed by experts after their deaths. Meanwhile, Russia has suffered another major disaster. A Russian missile, seemingly out of control, resulted in a major embarrassment for President Vladimir Putin. According to reports, a Ukrainian-bound projectile struck Russian territory, causing a massive explosion. The moment the unruly missile, believed to be a Kh-22 or Kh-32, fell and hit the ground in the Lipetsk region of Russia, some 560 kilometers from the war zone, was captured on a dash cam. The huge sinkhole caused by the explosion is thought to have caused a power outage and plunged 540 homes into darkness. The failed cruise missile was both an expensive and embarrassing mistake for Russia. The Kh-22 cost around $1 million, while the more advanced Kh-32 cost a jaw-dropping $3.5 million. The Lipetsk regional government, loyal to Putin, said the explosion was the result of a used stage of an aviation missile system. But other sources rejected this assessment. They argued that the shape of the missile was clearly visible and that a spent projectile would not have caused such a large explosion. The Baza channel, a Russian news channel with sources in law enforcement agencies, said, residents of a village in the Zelenskyy district heard a huge explosion, after which electricity, water, and in some places even cell phone communications were cut off in their homes. According to the Ukrainian news agency UNN, residents of a village in the Yelets region heard a loud noise, after which they lost electricity and water. Locals saw a large crater on the field and thought it was an enemy missile or a drone. No one was killed or injured in the explosion, but some buildings were reportedly damaged. According to Baza, up to 540 private residences in 6 settlements may have been affected. This is not the first time Russia has made such a gaffe. In January last year, the Russian Defense Ministry admitted that one of its planes accidentally dropped ammunition while flying over the village of Petropavlovka in the Voronezh region. In clips circulating on social media, several buildings could be seen blackened by fire and smoke, with windows destroyed. A large hole could also be seen in the ground. The ministry claimed that no one was injured. Just a few days later, an FAB-250 unguided munition was unloaded over the village of Rubizhne in the Russian-occupied Luhansk region of Ukraine. The British Ministry of Defense noted that these latest incidents took place during Russian combat sorties. Putin used Kursk and Kh-32 missiles to terrorize Ukraine during the war. The Kh-22 missile was developed in the early 1960s to hit enemy air defenses and destroy large vessels such as aircraft carriers, military bases, ships, power plants, and bridges. The Kh-22 could reportedly fly at 4,000 km/h or 2,486 mph. The Kh-32 is an updated variant of the Kh-22 that is physically identical. It was designed to be carried by the Tu-22M3 supersonic bomber and was accepted into service in 2016. The new missile includes a conventional warhead, an improved rocket engine, and a new radar imaging terminal seeker. It has a longer range but a smaller warhead. All the while, the Ukrainian leader continues his political negotiations for the welfare of his country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine has received more than $70 billion in military aid from the United States, but claims that U.S. support is $100 to $200 billion are not true. Zelensky continued his words as follows. As the president of a country at war, I can say that we have received more than $75 billion. But the allegations that Ukraine received $100 billion of the $177 billion total, or $200 billion as some say, is absolutely not true. This is important because we are talking about details. We received this aid not in cash but in arms. The total value of the weapons we have received is just over $70 billion. He added that the U.S. has provided a variety of assistance, including humanitarian and social programs and education and training. However, he emphasized that the claim that Ukraine received $200 billion specifically for military purposes is misleading. Expressing his gratitude for the support, Zelensky said that the figures of $75 and $76 billion and $200 billion are not comparable. He also noted that additional aid was provided in the humanitarian sector, such as support for Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Zelensky said that the energy sector aid is around $200 million and the health sector aid is around $100 million. This $400 million is earmarked for state programs, but we will meet these needs either with our partners in Europe or with domestic resources. Zelensky also stressed the importance of veteran support programs, which require constant support in wartime. But he explained that these are direct grants from U.S. agencies to specific organizations, not funds allocated to Ukraine's state budget. This is not money that comes into our budget. This is direct assistance from American institutions to these organizations. Zelensky also said that there are numerous other humanitarian programs with which the Ukrainian government has no direct connection. Earlier, it was stated that the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump stopped foreign aid under the USAID program for 90 days. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called on Ukraine's allies to provide more support to guarantee a lasting peace that would deter Russian President Vladimir Putin from considering another attack. At the same time, Rutte stressed the need to strengthen collective defense capabilities. In an interview with the German newspaper Bild am Sonntag, Rutte pointed out that Russia has paid a heavy price for minimal territorial gains. Rutte continued his words as follows: "The Russians are paying the price with 1,000 to 2,500 people a day killed or seriously injured. And yet the Russians are not achieving their goals. And our task is to make sure that they never achieve their goals. So no, Ukraine is not losing, and we have to support them to come to a strong position." Referring to the prospects for a peace deal, Putin said that one should not be naive about Putin. "We must ensure that Putin will never again be able to conquer even 1 square kilometer of Ukraine," Rutte said. He said that Putin must be prevented from thinking about attacking NATO after peace has been achieved. Otherwise, it would be disastrous for him. Rutte listed the main precondition for any negotiations as follows: Ukraine's partners must continue to provide weapons and training to the military to put Kyiv in the strongest possible position. He also underlined the urgency of increasing European defense production and spending. "The right decisions must be taken, and they need to be taken urgently this year," he said. Since 2014, European allies and Canada have invested more than $640 billion in defense, and more than 2/3 of NATO members now meet the 2% GDP benchmark for military spending, Rutte said. But more investment is needed, he said, and the allies will decide in the coming months exactly how to measure it. Rutte emphasized that it will be much more than 2%, and reminded that NATO's economy is 20 times larger than Russia's. Rutte then concluded his remarks as follows: "We need additional production lines, additional shifts, more ammunition, more Leopard 2 tanks, more F-35 fighter jets, more weapons throughout NATO territory, more money, more industrial production. Then we can succeed in deterring him. Then he will never dare to attack us." During his first term, U.S. President Donald Trump called on European NATO members to increase their defense spending. He has now proposed raising the target to 5% of GDP, but some countries have only recently reached the 2% threshold. Following Rutte, the leaders of Britain and Germany also showed their support for Ukraine. In a meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer emphasized the importance of ensuring that Ukraine has the strongest possible hand to achieve peace through force in the coming months. The report of the meeting read as follows: "The leaders began by assessing the progress made between the UK and Germany in recent months, including the signing of the Trinity House Agreement on Defense and the Joint Action Plan on Irregular Migration." Turning to the situation in Ukraine, the Prime Minister reported on his recent visit and reiterated that it is important to ensure that the country is in the strongest possible position in the coming months so that peace through strength can be achieved. The heads of government agreed that Russia's invasion of Ukraine highlights the importance of increasing and coordinating defense production across Europe. In this context, the British Prime Minister announced that the country's strategic defense review will incorporate the lessons learned from Russia's war against Ukraine and the need to counter Vladimir Putin's continued aggression and hostile actions across Europe. The leaders also discussed Starmer's visit to the European Council and the restructuring between the UK and the European Union. The Prime Minister said the UK is committed to strengthening its relationship with the EU to deliver further growth and closer security ties, which she believes will benefit all parties, the press release said. Thank you for tuning in.